James Knox Polk was the 11th President of the United States. Polk was born in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and moved to Tennessee to study law. After building a successful law practice, he was elected to the Tennessee legislature and then to United States House of Representatives in 1825, a leading Democrat and close ally of Andrew Jackson during the second party system. Polk served as the 13th Speaker of the House of Representatives from 1835 to 1839, making him the only president to have served as House Speaker. He left Congress to serve as governor of Tennessee from 1839 to 1841, after losing re-election as governor in 1840, and losing in another gubernatorial election in 1842. Polk was a dark horse candidate for president in 1844, though he entered the convention hoping to be nominated for vice president. He won the presidential nomination as a compromise candidate among the various party factions. In the general election, he defeated Henry Clay of the rival Whig Party in large part due to his promise to annex the Republic of Texas. True to his campaign pledge to serve only one term as president, Polk left office in March 1849 and returned to Tennessee. He died of cholera 3 months later. Polk is often considered the last strong pre-Civil War president, having met during his 4 years in office every major domestic and foreign policy goal set during his campaign and the transition to his administration. When Mexico rejected the U.S. annexation of Texas, Polk achieved a sweeping victory in the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the cession by Mexico of nearly the whole of what is now the American Southwest. He ensured a substantial reduction of tariff rates by replacing the black tariff with the Walker tariff of 1846, which pleased the less industrialized states of his native South by rendering less expensive both imported and, through competition, domestic goods. He threatened war with the United Kingdom over the issue of which nation owned the Oregon country, eventually reaching a settlement in which the British were made to sell the portion that became the Oregon Territory. Additionally, he re-established the independent treasury system, supplanted by the Federal Reserve System in 1913, oversaw the opening of the U.S. Naval Academy and of the Smithsonian Institution, the groundbreaking for the Washington Monument, and the issuance of the first United States postage stamp. Scholars have ranked him favorably on lists of greatest presidents for his ability to promote, obtain support for, and achieve all of the major items on his presidential agenda. However, he has also been criticized for leading the country into war against Mexico and for exacerbating sectional divides. Polk has been called the least known consequential president of the United States. Early life. James Knox Polk, the first of 10 children, was born on November 2, 1795 in a log house. Like many early Scots-Irish settlers in the North Carolina mountains, the Knox and Polk families were Presbyterian, while Polk's mother Jane remained a devout Presbyterian her entire life. His father Samuel, whose own father, Ezekiel Polk, was a deist, rejected dogmatic Presbyterianism. When the parents took the young James to a Presbyterian church to be baptized, the father Samuel refused to declare his belief in Christianity, and the minister refused to baptize the child. In 1803, most of Polk's relatives moved to the Duck River area in what is now Maury County, Middle Tennessee. Polk's family waited until 1806 to follow. Polk was homeschooled. When Polk recovered, his father offered to bring him into the mercantile business, but Polk refused. At Murfreesboro, Polk proved a promising student. In January 1816, Polk was admitted into the University of North Carolina as a second-semester sophomore. The Polk family had connections with the university, then a small school of about 80 students. Sam Polk was their land agent for Tennessee, and his cousin, William Polk, was a trustee. After his graduation from the University of North Carolina, Polk traveled to Nashville to study law under renowned Nashville trial attorney Felix Grundy. Early political career. In 1822, Polk joined the Tennessee militia as a captain in the cavalry regiment of the 5th Brigade. He was later appointed a colonel on the staff of Governor William Carroll, and was afterwards often referred to or addressed by his military title. Polk courted Sarah Childress, and they married on January 1, 1824 in Murfreesboro. In 1824, Jackson ran for president but was defeated. In 1825, Polk ran for the United States House of Representatives for the Tennessee's 6th Congressional District. Polk won re-election in 1827, and continued to oppose the Adams administration. Speaker of the House. In June 1834, Speaker of the House Andrew Stevenson resigned from Congress. As Speaker, Polk worked for the policies of Jackson and, after 1836, Van Buren. Polk appointed committees with Democratic chairs and majorities, including the New York Radical C. Cambriling as chair of the Ways and Means Committee. Although he maintained the facade of traditional bipartisanship, the two major issues during Polk's speakership were slavery and, after the Panic of 1837, the economy. Polk took advantage of the gag rule to quiet the slavery debate within the House. Van Buren and Polk faced pressure to rescind the Specie Circular, an act that had been signed by Jackson to boost the economy. The act required that payment for government lands be in gold and silver. However, with support from Polk and his cabinet, Van Buren chose to stick with the Specie Circular. Polk and Van Buren attempted to establish an independent treasury system that would allow the government to oversee its own deposits, rather than using national or pet banks. But the bill was defeated in the House. Polk attempted to make a more orderly House. Unlike many of his peers, he never challenged anyone to a duel no matter how much they insulted his honor. Polk remains the only president who served as Speaker of the House. Governor of Tennessee. In 1835, Democrats had lost the governorship of Tennessee for the first time in the party's history, and Polk decided to return home to help the state party. In the 1839 Tennessee gubernatorial election, Polk defeated two-term incumbent Whig Newton Cannon by about 2,500 votes, out of about 105,000 total votes. Polk and Jackson hoped that Polk's election would serve as a springboard to the vice presidential nomination in 1840 and the presidency in 1844. But the 1840 Democratic National Convention split among Polk and incumbent Richard Mentor Johnson, and failed to nominate anyone for the position. Polk's three major programs during his governorship, regulating state banks, implementing state internal improvements, and improving education, all failed to win the approval of the legislature. Election of 1844. Following his 1843 gubernatorial loss, Polk became determined to become the next vice president of the United States. As the convention began on May 27, 1844, the key question was whether the convention would adopt a rule requiring the presidential nominee to receive the vote of two-thirds of the delegates. Polk had not attended the convention, and when he learned of his nomination, Polk stated, "It has been well observed that the office of President of the United States should neither be sought nor declined. I have never sought it, nor should I feel at liberty to decline it, if conferred upon me by the voluntary suffrages of my fellow citizens." Because the Democratic Party was splintered into bitter factions, Polk promised to serve only one term if elected, hoping that his disappointed rival Democrats would unite behind him with the knowledge that another candidate would be chosen in 4 years. Incumbent President John Tyler, a former Democrat and Whig, had been expelled from the Whig Party in September 1841. Despite Polk's support of the annexation of Texas, Tyler considered running an independent re-election campaign, but he agreed to withdraw after Jackson encouraged Democrats to welcome Tyler's followers into the party. Polk lost both his birth state, North Carolina, and his state of residence, Tennessee, the only successful presidential candidate to do so, until Donald Trump lost New York in 2016. However, he won Pennsylvania and New York, where Clay lost votes to the anti-slavery Liberty Party candidate James G. Birney. After being informed of his victory on November 15, 1844, Polk turned his attention towards forming a geographically balanced cabinet. Thus, Polk's initial cabinet selections would consist of Buchanan as Secretary of State, Walker as Secretary of the Treasury, Marcy as Secretary of War, Mason as Attorney General, Cave Johnson as Postmaster General, and Bancroft as Secretary of the Navy. All would win Senate confirmation after Polk took office. While Polk put together his cabinet, President Tyler sought to complete the annexation of Texas. While the Senate had defeated an earlier treaty that would annex the Republic, Tyler sought to pass a joint resolution through both houses of Congress. Presidency. When he took office on March 4, 1845, Polk, at 49, became the youngest man at the time to assume the presidency. Polk's inauguration was the first inaugural ceremony to be reported by telegraph and to be shown in a newspaper illustration, in the Illustrated London News. According to a story told decades later by George Bancroft, Polk set 4 clearly defined goals for his administration. While his domestic aims represented continuity with past Democratic policies, successful completion of Polk's foreign policy goals would represent the first major American territorial gains since the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. During his presidency, James K. Polk was known as Young Hickory, an allusion to his mentor Andrew Jackson, and Napoleon of the Stump, for his speaking skills. Personnel. Administration and Cabinet. Judicial appointments. Supreme Court. Polk nominated both George W. Woodward of Pennsylvania and Levi Woodbury of New Hampshire in December 1845. Woodbury was confirmed, but Woodward was rejected by the Senate in 1846. Woodward's nomination was defeated in large part due to the opposition of Buchanan and Pennsylvania Senator Simon Cameron. Polk subsequently nominated Robert Cooper Grier of Pennsylvania, and Grier won confirmation. Woodbury died in 1851, but Grier served until 1870 and notably joined with the majority decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Other judicial appointments. Polk appointed 8 other federal judges, 1 to the United States Circuit Court of the District of Columbia, and 7 to various United States district courts. Foreign policy. Polk strongly supported expansion and relations with Mexico and Great Britain, the country's southern and northern neighbors respectively, dominated Polk's presidency. Polk, like many other Democrats, fervently believed in the idea of manifest destiny, and he sought to create a bicoastal nation. Polk was successful in pursuing this goal, as his presidency saw the partition of Oregon country with Britain, the annexation of Texas, and the acquisition of vast amounts of land from Mexico. Partition of Oregon country. Map of Oregon country, which the Oregon Treaty split between the Americans and British at the 49th parallel. Since the signing of the Treaty of 1818, the Oregon country had been under the joint occupation and control of the United Kingdom and the United States. Previous U.S. administrations had offered to divide the region along the 49th parallel, which was not acceptable to Britain, as they had commercial interests along the Columbia River. After Pakenham's rejection, Polk broke off negotiations and returned to the Democratic platform's All Oregon demand, which called for all of Oregon up to the 54-40 line that marked the southern boundary of Russian Alaska. 54-40 or fight now became a popular rallying cry among Democrats. When the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Aberdeen, learned of the proposal rejected by Pakenham, Aberdeen asked the United States to reopen negotiations. After the brief collapse of British Prime Minister Robert Peel's second ministry, Peel and Aberdeen sought closer relations with the United States as part of a reorientation towards free trade. The portion of the Oregon Territory acquired by the United States later formed the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and parts of the states of Montana and Wyoming. The borders established by the Oregon Treaty now constitute a portion of the Canada-United States border. Annexation of Texas. Map of Mexico in 1845. With the Republic of Texas, the Republic of Yucatan and the disputed territory between Mexico and Texas in red. Mexico claimed to own all of Texas. The Republic of Texas had gained independence from Mexico following the Texas Revolution of 1836. Many Texians had migrated from the United States, and many Americans and Texians sought to make Texas a part of America following the Texas Revolution. Upon hearing of Polk's election to office, President Tyler had urged Congress to pass a joint resolution admitting Texas to the Union, and Congress complied on February 28, 1845. Polk's first major decision in office was whether to recall Tyler's emissary to Texas, who bore an offer of annexation based on that act of Congress. The annexation of Texas would lead to increased tensions with Mexico, which had never recognized Texan independence. Mexican-American War. Origins of the war. Perhaps the most important event of Polk's presidency was the Mexican-American War. Though the United States had been the first country to recognize Mexico's independence following the Mexican War of Independence, relations between the two countries began to sour in the 1830s. Though Polk genuinely desired to avoid a war with Mexico, he more strongly desired the acquisition of Texas and Alta California. In March 1846, Slidell finally left Mexico after the government refused his demand to be formally received. Some Whigs, such as Abraham Lincoln, challenged Polk's version of events. Course of the war. In May 1846, Taylor led the U.S. in the inconclusive Battle of Palo Alto, the first major battle of the war. In 1845, Polk, fearful of French or British intervention, had sent Lieutenant Archibald H. Gillespie to California with orders to foment a pro-American rebellion that could be used to justify annexation of the territory. At its outbreak, the war enjoyed support across the nation. In July 1846, American envoy Alexander Slidell Mackenzie met with Santa Anna, offering terms in which the U.S. would pay to acquire the San Francisco Bay and other parts of Alta California. In the September 1846 Battle of Monterey, Taylor defeated a Mexican force led by Impudia, but allowed Impudia's forces to withdraw, much to Polk's consternation. In April 1847, Scott defeated a Mexican force led by Santa Anna at the Battle of Cerro Gordo. Peace, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Mexican cession, in red, was acquired through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Gadsden Purchase, in orange, was acquired through purchase after Polk left office. In September 1847, Manuel de la Peña y Peña replaced Santa Anna as President of Mexico, and Peña and his Moderado allies showed a willingness to negotiate based on the terms Polk had relayed to Trist. Throughout January 1848, Trist regularly met with Mexican officials in Guadalupe Hidalgo. a small town north of Mexico City. The Mexican cession added 600,000 square miles of territory to the United States, including a long Pacific coastline. The 1853 Gadsden Purchase would later acquire another 30,000 square miles from Mexico. The area eventually became part of Arizona and New Mexico, establishing the modern borders of the contiguous United States. Polk issued an official proclamation of the end of the war on July 4, 1848. The Compromise of 1850 would later settle a number of outstanding issues from Polk's presidency, including the admission of California as a state and the creation of New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory. Other initiatives. Polk's ambassador to the Republic of New Granada, Benjamin Alden Bidlack, negotiated the Mallarino-Bidlack Treaty with the government of New Granada. In mid-1848, President Polk authorized his ambassador to Spain, Romulus Mitchell Saunders, to negotiate the purchase of Cuba and offer Spain up to $100 million, an astounding sum at the time for one territory, equal to $2.77 billion in present-day terms. Domestic policy. Fiscal policy. In his inaugural address, Polk called upon Congress to re-establish the independent Treasury system under which government funds were held in the Treasury and not in banks or other financial institutions. Polk's other major domestic initiative was the lowering of the tariff, as Polk argued that the tariff should only be as high as necessary for the operation of the federal government. Rivers and Harbors Veto. Congress passed the Rivers and Harbors Bill in 1846 to provide $500,000 to improve rivers and harbors, but Polk vetoed the bill. It would have provided for federally funded internal improvements on small harbors. Polk believed that this was unconstitutional because the bill unfairly favored particular areas, including ports which had no foreign trade. Polk believed that these problems were local and not national. Polk feared that passing the Rivers and Harbors Bill would encourage legislators to compete for favors for their home districts. A type of corruption that would spell doom to the virtue of the Republic. Slavery. Like Jackson, Polk saw slavery as a side issue compared to more important matters such as territorial expansion and economic policy. Polk was a slaveholder for his entire life. His father, Samuel Polk, had left Polk more than 8,000 acres of land, and divided about 53 slaves to his widow and children after he died. James inherited 20 of his father's slaves, either directly or from deceased brothers. In 1831, he became an absentee cotton planter, sending slaves to clear plantation land that his father had left him near Somerville, Tennessee. 4 years later, Polk sold his Somerville plantation and, together with his brother-in-law, bought 920 acres of land, a cotton plantation near Coffeyville, Mississippi. He ran this plantation for the rest of his life, eventually taking it over completely from his brother-in-law. Polk rarely sold slaves, although once he became president and could better afford it, he bought more. Polk's will stipulated that their slaves were to be freed after his wife Sarah had died. However, the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation and the 1865 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution freed all remaining slaves in rebel states long before the death of his wife in 1891. On March 4, 2017, the burials of two of his slaves, Elias Polk and Matilda Polk, were replaced with tombstones in the Nashville City Cemetery. Department of the Interior. One of Polk's last acts as president was to sign the bill creating the Department of the Interior. This was the first new cabinet position created since the early days of the Republic. Polk had misgivings about the federal government usurping power over public lands from the states. However, The delivery of the legislation on his last full day in office gave him no time to find constitutional grounds for a veto, or to draft a sufficient veto message. So Polk signed the bill. Election of 1848. Honoring his pledge to serve only one term, Polk declined to seek re-election in 1848. However, Polk's actions strongly affected the 1848 race. With Polk out of the race, the Democratic Party remained fractured along geographic lines, with Senators Cass and Calhoun the leading Western and Southern candidates, respectively. During the course of the Mexican War, Generals Taylor and Scott emerged as strong Whig candidates, alongside anti-war Senator Thomas Corwin and longtime party leader Henry Clay. In New York, an anti-slavery Democratic faction known as the Barn Burners strongly supported the Wilmot Proviso, and rejected Cass. Van Buren was joined on the Free Soil Party's ticket by Charles Francis Adams Sr., son of former President and prominent Whig John Quincy Adams. In the election, Taylor won 47.3% of the popular vote and a majority of the electoral vote, giving the Whigs control of the presidency. Cass won 42.5% of the vote, while Van Buren finished with 10.1% of the popular vote, more than any other third-party presidential candidate at that time. Despite the increasingly polarizing slavery debate, Taylor and Cass both won a mix of northern and southern states. However, much of Van Buren's support came from northern Democrats. States admitted to the Union. Post-presidency. An undated daguerreotype of James K. Polk, from late in his presidential term or perhaps in the months after he left office. Polk's time in the White House took its toll on his health. Full of enthusiasm and vigor when he entered office, Polk left on March 4, 1849, exhausted by his years of public service. He lost weight and had deep lines on his face and dark circles under his eyes. He is believed to have contracted cholera in New Orleans, Louisiana, on a goodwill tour of the South after leaving the White House. In 1893, the bodies of President and Mrs. Polk were exhumed and relocated to their current resting place on the grounds of the Tennessee state capitol in Nashville. Polk Place was demolished in 1900. Polk had the shortest retirement of all presidents at 103 days. He was the youngest former president to die in retirement at the age of 53. Only James A. Garfield and John F. Kennedy, who were assassinated in office, died at a younger age, along with George Washington, Andrew Johnson, Chester A. Arthur, Calvin Coolidge and Lyndon B. Johnson. He is one of 6 presidents to have died while his direct successor was in office. Reputation. Polk's historic reputation was largely formed by the attacks made on him in his own time. Whig politicians claimed that he was drawn from a well-deserved obscurity. Sam Houston is said to have observed that Polk was a victim of the use of water as a beverage. Polk is now recognized, not only as the strongest president between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, but also the president who made the United States a coast-to-coast nation. When historians began ranking the presidents in 1948, Polk ranked 10th in Arthur M. Schlesinger's poll, and has subsequently ranked 8th in Schlesinger's 1962 poll, 11th in the Reuters-McIver poll, 11th in the most recent Siena poll, 9th in the most recent Wall Street Journal poll, and 12th in the latest C-SPAN poll. He is usually among the highest-ranking one-term presidents. Polk biographers over the years have sized up the magnitude of Polk's achievements and his legacy, particularly his 2 most recent. There are 3 key reasons why James K. Polk deserves recognition as a significant and influential American president. Walter Borneman wrote, "First, Polk accomplished the objectives of his presidential term as he defined them. Second, He was the most decisive chief executive before the Civil War. And third, he greatly expanded the executive power of the presidency, particularly its war powers, its role as commander-in-chief, and its oversight of the executive branch. Quote, "Well, Polk's legacy thus takes many forms. The most outstanding is the map of the continental United States, whose landmass he increased by a third. To look at that map," Robert Mary concluded, "and to take in the western and southwestern expanse included in it, is to see the magnitude of Polk's presidential accomplishments." Quote, "Nevertheless, Polk's aggressive expansionism has been criticized on ethical grounds. He believed in manifest destiny even more than most did." Referencing the Mexican-American War, General Ulysses S. Grant stated that, "I was bitterly opposed to the